Your nervous system is not necessarily calmer with a partner who loves you consistently than with one who keeps you guessing. Take a slow breath. Let your body find the weight of wherever you are right now. We have time tonight, and there is no rush. Because what we are going to move through together is not a story about too much need. It is a story about a nervous system. Your nervous system, if this is your pattern, shaped by a specific history to run a specific kind of scan. Constant, sensitive, tuned to catch the faintest signal of disconnection before it can arrive, and running even when there is nothing to find, especially when there is nothing to find. There is a finding I want to hold for the second half of tonight, something documented in research on how anxiously attached people appraise positive emotional experiences, something that emerged almost as a side note and then could not be unfound. That will reframe what the longing and the checking and the needing to know actually is. Not a flaw, not damage. Something far more precise than either of those words. And there is something older still. Something discovered in a laboratory in the 1970s in observations of infants that were meant to be about something else entirely, that will change your understanding of when this pattern was built and what it was built to do. You know this feeling. The partner who does not text back for a few hours, and you start running the math. What did I say? What shifted? Is this the beginning of something? Is this already over? The conversation you replay, searching for the moment the temperature changed. The reassurance you receive and hold like a lit match. Knowing the warmth will last minutes and not hours before you need another one. There is something very specific about this experience that tends not to get named. It is not only that the anxiety is uncomfortable, it is that it arrives before there is anything to be anxious about. The message has been gone for 40 minutes. By any reasonable measure, this is a person going about their day. And yet the body is already in a different story. A story that has already written the ending and is now searching the present for evidence that it is true. The feeling is not rational and does not respond to rational reassurance. And you know this, which adds its own particular weight. You are aware that what you are feeling is disproportionate. You are aware that it looks like a pattern from the outside, and you cannot stop it from the inside. The language the world uses for this is mostly a story about excess, too needy, too sensitive, too present in your own longing. The anxious partner calls too often, asks for reassurance too constantly, reads into pauses too deeply, holds on too tight. The narrative is one of wanting more than is reasonable, of loving in a way that exhausts the people around you, of being someone who would be easier to be with if you could just trust a little more. And the self-help framing follows the same shape. The fear of abandonment is the root. The inconsistent caregiver is the origin. The solution is to develop trust, build self-esteem, practice tolerating uncertainty. The work is on you, and what you need to do is want less. This is not wrong, exactly, but it is looking at the wrong thing entirely. Because anxious attachment is not primarily a story about need. The research has been clear on this for decades. It is a story about threat detection. It is a story about a nervous system that was taught in a very early part of your life to keep the alarm running, to never arrive at the conclusion of safety, to remain alert because the signal had learned to come without warning. The need is secondary. The alarm is primary. And that difference between a problem of wanting too much and a problem of a nervous system calibrated to never believe it has enough changes everything about what the behaviors mean, why the feelings are so physical and involuntary, and why the research reveals something that the popular framing almost entirely misses. The hardest part of healing is not learning to stop being afraid. It is learning to sit inside a nervous system that has been calibrated for chaos and tolerate, genuinely tolerate, an encounter with something calm. There is a finding I am holding for the second half of tonight about what happens when your nervous system finally encounters exactly what it has been asking for. That will make that sentence land differently than it does right now. Before we move into the neuroscience, I want to name something. If you have ever been in a relationship where you were called too much, where the checking and the asking and the needing to know were framed as the problem, as the reason things were difficult, then what the research is about to show you is not only a framework. It is in part a reckoning with something that happened to you before you were old enough to have chosen any of it. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth was studying something that at the time appeared procedurally simple: how infants respond to brief separations from their caregivers. Ainsworth had trained under John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who proposed, in his landmark work through the 1950s and 60s, that the human infant arrives in the world with a biological imperative to attach, not a preference, not a tendency. An imperative, wired as deeply as hunger, whose entire function is proximity to the caregiver. Because for a small and helpless creature, the caregiver's presence is synonymous with survival. Bowlby called this the attachment behavioral system. When the caregiver is present and responsive, the system quiets, and the infant is free to explore. When the caregiver is absent or unresponsive, the system activates. Driving crying, clinging, protest, whatever behavior has historically worked to bring the caregiver back into range. Ainsworth took this framework and made it observable. She developed what became known as the strange situation procedure, a structured laboratory observation in which a mother and her infant, between 9 and 18 months old, are brought into an unfamiliar room, introduced to a stranger, and then separated, so that the infant's responses to both departure and reunion can be carefully coded. What she observed across these sessions led her to identify 3 distinct patterns of infant attachment behavior, with a 4th later added by her colleague Mary Main in the 1980s. The first was secure attachment. The infant was distressed by separation, but was readily comforted on reunion, using the caregiver as a reliable base from which to explore. The second was avoidant attachment. The infant appeared unbothered on the surface, showing little distress and little interest in reunion, though later physiological studies would reveal that the apparent calm masked significant internal activation. The body was not at ease. It was defending. And then there was the third pattern. Ainsworth called it anxious ambivalent, or sometimes resistant. These were the infants who were difficult to settle even before anything had happened. They explored less. They stayed closer. And when the caregiver left, they came apart. Deeply, inconsolably. But the remarkable thing was not the crying on departure. It was what happened at reunion. The caregiver returned, and these infants rushed toward them, and then could not be comforted, clinging and pushing away at the same moment, seeking contact and rejecting it, being held and still not settling. And then the detail that should give you pause, because it changes the meaning of everything else. These infants were already showing distress before the caregiver had even left the room. The alarm was running in anticipation of a threat that had not yet arrived, not because something was wrong with the child, because something had been inconsistent in the caregiving. Warmth and attunement on some days, distraction or emotional absence on others. And the nervous system had done exactly what nervous systems do. It learned from the pattern of what was most likely, based on what had happened before. If presence cannot be counted on, you do not wait for the absence to begin worrying. You start worrying now, while presence is still here, because this is how you stay ahead of the danger. It was not a broken alarm. It was an alarm that had been taught to never turn off. What Ainsworth described in behavioral terms, decades of research since, has traced into the nervous system itself. The researchers Mario Michelincher and Philip Shaver, whose work on adult attachment, conducted from the 1990s through the present, has become foundational to the field, describe the anxious attachment pattern as reliant on what they call hyperactivating strategies. Not hyperactivity in the everyday sense, but a specific mode of operation in which the attachment system is kept in a state of chronic, elevated activation. The scan does not stop. The process never reaches a conclusion of safety. To understand what that feels like to live inside, it helps to know what Dr. Stephen Porges, the neuroscientist who developed polyvagal theory in the 1990s, describes as neuroception, the autonomic nervous system's continuous, largely unconscious evaluation of the environment for cues of safety or danger. This is not a deliberate process. Your nervous system is reading tone of voice, facial microexpressions, the slight pause before a reply, the way someone's shoulders sit in a room, and making rapid assessments before your mind has formed a single conscious thought about any of it. For a nervous system shaped by consistent, reliable caregiving, this surveillance system is calibrated to something, like, most things are probably fine. Raise the alert when there is genuine cause. Return to baseline quickly. Psychiatrist Dan Siegel's concept of the window of tolerance, the band of arousal within which a person can function, connect, and regulate effectively, is relatively wide. The small uncertainties of a normal relationship do not crack the floor. For your nervous system, if this is your pattern, the calibration is different. The threshold is much lower. Your system was trained to detect the faint signal because, in the environment it learned in, the faint signal was the only warning there would be. And what was once an adaptive response, this hair trigger sensitivity, this readiness, becomes, in adult relationships, exhausting to live inside. McEulencer and Shaver's research documents this with precision. Those with anxious attachment tend to exaggerate the negative appraisal of threatening events, perceive them in more catastrophic terms, and experience emotional overload in response to stressors that others metabolize more easily. There is a background hum of vigilance that does not quiet when the relationship is going well. It is not soothed by evidence of safety. It is only briefly interrupted by it. Research using autonomic measures suggests that insecurely attached individuals show dysregulation in the architecture of their nervous system. The ventral vagal complex, the branch of the vagus nerve that Porges identifies as supporting social engagement, and the felt sense of safety, has reduced tone. The sympathetic nervous system, the one that drives fight or flight, sits closer to the surface. Ready. What that readiness costs, day to day, is something the clinical literature tends to understate. Living inside a hyperactivated nervous system is tiring in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who does not share it. It is not the dramatic, obvious exhaustion of a crisis. It is the low-grade, continuous expenditure of energy on a scan that never concludes. You monitor tone of voice in text messages. You replay the interaction from earlier, searching for the moment it might have shifted. You feel, in the hours after a good evening with someone you love, a creeping unease that has no specific content. Just a whisper that it was too good, that something will come to balance it. The good things do not fully land because the part of you running the surveillance is already scanning the horizon for what might take them away. This is not anxiety in the sense of a diagnosable condition that needs treatment above all else. It is, more precisely, what a body looks like when it was taught very early that the cost of relaxing was being caught off guard. That vigilance was the reasonable price of staying connected to the people you needed. That the alarm was the only reliable tool you had. Here's what that means for how you experience your own relationships. A partner's silence at dinner does not just register as quiet. Your nervous system reads it as possible withdrawal, which it reads as possible abandonment, which, and this is what the cultural narrative of too much need completely misses, your body processes with the same urgency as a physical threat, not as a metaphor, as a measurement. The floor does not drop because you are overreacting. The floor drops because you are reading the room with a very old and very fine-tuned instrument. and the instrument is doing exactly what it was calibrated to do. There is a piece of neuroscience here that explains something the willpower-based approach to anxious attachment has never been able to account for. In the 1980s and 90s, the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz was mapping the dopamine system in primates, charting precisely when and why dopamine neurons fired. What he expected was that dopamine responded to reward. What he found instead changed the field's understanding of motivation at its foundation. Dopamine does not fire when you receive a reward. It fires when you anticipate that a reward might be coming. More precisely, dopamine fires most intensely in the gap between uncertainty and possibility. In the space where you do not know yet whether the good thing will arrive. A guaranteed reward produces a comparatively flat signal. A certain absence produces nothing. It is the not knowing, the maybe, the suspended possibility. This is what keeps the system lit. This is the biology behind slot machines, behind compulsive phone checking, behind the hold an inconsistent person can have over you that a reliably available one sometimes cannot match. Take a moment with that. In a secure relationship, one characterized by consistent warmth and reliable presence, your dopamine system, over time, learns the pattern and settles. The brain decodes the reward schedule. The gap between uncertainty and possibility closes regularly. Safety registers, and the body rests. In a relationship built on inconsistency, a partner who is warm and then cold, available and then absent, affectionate and then withdrawn, with no discernible pattern, that gap never closes. Your brain, which is above almost everything else a prediction machine, keeps working, keeps scanning, keeps trying to find the rule that governs when the reward arrives, because once it finds the rule, it can rest. It never finds the rule, and so the system stays activated. The anticipation does not resolve. The craving is not a choice. It is structural. This is the neurological architecture beneath what the attachment literature calls protest behavior, the behaviors that emerge when the connection feels threatened. Calling repeatedly, starting an argument to provoke a response, going quiet to see if they will come looking, analyzing tone, reading silences, catching the earliest flicker of emotional distance. These behaviors did not originate in your adult relationships. They originated in cribs. They are the adult expression of what the ambivalent infant was doing in Ainsworth's laboratory, clinging and pushing away in the same breath, escalating, doing whatever could be done to bring the uncertain caregiver back into range. When soft bids for proximity did not reliably work, the bids got louder. Michelintzer and Shaver describe this as the hyperactivating strategy, not manipulation, not emotional immaturity, but the logical output of a learning environment in which intensity was the only signal that consistently got through. The word the culture uses for this in adults is needy, sometimes clingy, sometimes, in the wreckage of a relationship, crazy. Not one of those words acknowledges what the research is saying, that these behaviors are adaptive, that they were built by an environment that trained them, that they are, at the level of the nervous system, a survival strategy, and a very old one. That is not an excuse for the damage they can do, but it is the truth of what they are. Take a breath. Let what we have covered settle for a moment. The hyperactivated attachment system, the dopamine loop that never resolves, the protest behaviors that began before you could speak. Everything so far has seemed to point toward a clear conclusion. The anxiously attached person is suffering because they cannot find enough safety. They are drawn to inconsistent partners because the dopamine system keeps them lit. In principle, the path forward seems clear. Find someone consistent. Find someone reliably warm and present. Let the nervous system learn that things are different now. Here is what the research did not expect to find. In studies conducted by Mickelinser and colleagues examining how people with different attachment styles appraise emotional experiences, something kept appearing in the data that resisted easy explanation. Anxiously attached participants, when exposed to experiences that others found comforting, expressions of sustained care, warmth delivered consistently and reliably, reassurance that was simply, steadily there, did not show relief. They showed inner conflict, self-doubt, something that resembled, in the data, a kind of bitterness. Let that sit for a moment. What this finding suggests, and the research frames it as correlation, not a simple cause and effect chain, is that the difficulty is not only that your nervous system has been drawn to inconsistent partners, it is that your nervous system has organized itself around inconsistency, come to rely on it as information. And when consistency finally arrives, the surveillance system, which has been running on the assumption that something is always slightly wrong, is handed quiet and does not know how to read it. Calm feels like the quiet before the storm. Warmth that is steady and unearned by any crisis feels, to this nervous system, like data is missing. Like something might be about to be taken away. Like the relationship lacks the kind of intensity that at some level registers as proof that it is real. Which means everything you heard in the first half of tonight looks different now. The draw toward inconsistent partners is not only about familiarity or the dopamine chase. It is also that your nervous system generates a specific kind of anxiety in the presence of someone genuinely, reliably safe. Because reliable safety is not on the frequency it was calibrated to read, and what sometimes gets mistaken for lack of chemistry, for the relationship not feeling electric enough, for the secure person being somehow too easy. Some of that is your surveillance system misreading the absence of threat as the absence of love. This is not a cognitive distortion you can correct by thinking differently. It is a physiological response. And it means that healing is not simply the work of finding the right person. It is the stranger, more disorienting work of tolerating, at first deliberately, over time, more naturally, the sensation that calm produces in a nervous system that was never taught. That calm is where safety lives. There is one more implication of this that deserves to be said plainly, because the popular culture discussion of anxious attachment almost never says it. The anxious avoidant pairing. The classic dynamic where the anxiously attached person is drawn repeatedly to emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, or dismissive partners is not primarily a pattern of poor choices. It is, to a significant degree, a pattern of nervous system recognition. The partner who keeps you guessing activates the dopamine system and lights up the attachment behavioral system simultaneously. The result is an experience of intensity, of aliveness, of feeling fully present in the relationship in a way that can be mistaken for depth, for connection, for the thing the self-help books describe as chemistry. The securely attached partner, the one who texts back, shows up, does what shit it. They say, loves you without manufacturing uncertainty, does not produce this. The nervous system, calibrated to intermittent reinforcement, reads consistency as flatness, reads reliability as absence of feeling, the absence of the push-pull, the absence of the chase, the absence of the thing to decode. It can feel like the relationship has no stakes, like the other person does not really care enough, like something is missing that you cannot name. What is missing is not love. What is missing is anxiety. And your nervous system, at some level, learned to read anxiety as the signal that love was real. Because in the environment that built it, love and anxiety were never far apart. This does not mean securely attached partners are not compelling, or that anxious connection is the only path to depth. It means that the nervous system needs time and new data to learn that depth can arrive without turbulence. That intimacy can be warm and steady and still be exactly what it looks like. If this is your pattern, you know what the loop feels like from inside it. The cycle has a shape that the research documents with precision. You pursue. Your partner, who may carry their own history, their own learned distance, retreats. The retreat activates more alarm. More alarm produces more pursuit. More pursuit produces more retreat. Michelinser's research describes how anxiously attached individuals respond to perceived violations of trust, not with direct conversation, necessarily, but with rumination, an internal loop that cycles through possible explanations, possible reassurances, possible confirmations of fear, without ever arriving at resolution. And one negative emotion in your nervous system has a documented tendency to spread into others. What begins as worry about one unanswered message becomes evidence of the relationship's fragility, which becomes evidence of your unlovability, which lands eventually on everything the working model already suspected. This is what the people outside the relationship call overthinking. This is what it actually is. A body that is convinced something is wrong, and a mind trying to catch up, and a gap between what you know intellectually. This person loves me. There is no emergency right now, and what your nervous system is insisting regardless. If you have lived in this gap, you know it precisely. The way it is possible to be told I love you and feel it land, and then 20 minutes later, need to hear it again. Not because you did not believe the first time, because your nervous system holds evidence of safety for a shorter duration than it holds evidence of threat. And so the reassurance is sought again and again. And each time the relief is real and brief, and the alarm restarts. Not because the reassurance was insufficient, but because it was never addressing the underlying calibration. It was feeding a system that cannot be stilled through that method alone. There is something harder still that needs to be named. Because the behaviors that emerge from this hyperactivated state, the protest behaviors, the pursuit, the testing, the escalation of a small silence into a full emotional event. These behaviors can genuinely damage what they were built to protect. Protest behavior exists to pull the other person closer. It often pushes them away. The repeated seeking of reassurance exists to quiet the alarm. It can exhaust a partner and create the very emotional withdrawal it was designed to prevent. And here is what makes this the most painful irony in the whole architecture. The alarm was built to respond to the environment, but the alarm is also generating the environment it most fears. And there is a cost that goes beyond the relationship. There is the cost to you, to the version of you that has been running this system for years or decades. The version who has spent enormous cognitive and emotional resources monitoring, interpreting, managing, and attempting to solve for safety in relationships that may never have been able to provide it. The exhaustion of loving from inside a hyperactivated nervous system is not only the exhaustion of the relationship cycle, it is the exhaustion of never having been able to fully rest inside a connection, of always arriving in intimacy slightly braced for what comes next, of the good moments carrying, somewhere in their edges, the knowledge that they will have to be checked, that they will need to be verified as still being true before too long. The research on anxious attachment and emotional regulation documents something that describes this precisely. Those with attachment anxiety experience what Michelinser and Shaver call an autonomous spread of negative emotion. One worry activates others, in a cascade that is not easily interrupted by evidence or reassurance, which means the person has been doing significant emotional labor, continuously, just to maintain a baseline that others may have arrived at without effort. That is not nothing. That is years of work done in the dark, without being named as work, in a nervous system that had been handed a job it never should have had. This is not a moral failing. It is an architecture. And an architecture, once you can see it clearly, can begin to be worked with differently. Here is what I want you to hold. Not as a general possibility for anxiously attached people somewhere, but as something the research is saying about the nervous system you are living inside right now. The concept of earned security, developed in the attachment literature and examined through a tool called the Adult Attachment Interview, co-developed by Mary Main, describes the possibility of arriving at a secure attachment orientation in adulthood, despite an insecure beginning. The finding, when it first appeared in the data, was quietly remarkable. Adults could be classified as securely attached even when describing profoundly difficult, inconsistent, or painful childhoods. Not because they minimized what happened, and not because they had idealized it, but because they had developed something specific: coherence, the capacity to narrate their own history in an organized and integrated way, to hold the painful and the loving in the same account, without collapsing into bitterness or floating into denial. That coherence, the research suggests, is what changes the internal working model. Not the absence of a wound, the integration of one. But here's the finding that matters most for where you are right now. Earned security does not require the anxiety to stop first. The change happens not by waiting for the threat detection system to quiet, and then, finally, beginning to trust. It happens by tolerating, imperfectly, while the alarm is still running, the experience of safety, long enough for the nervous system to begin to revise its prediction. One exposure at a time, the brain that was shaped by intermittent reinforcement to never stop scanning can also be recalibrated, slowly, by consistent evidence that the scanning is no longer required. And here is where the science and your lived experience become the same thing, because this is the part that changes what the work actually looks like. Healing from anxious attachment is not the work of becoming less, not the work of wanting less, asking for less, feeling less. The cultural message, quieter, calmer, less present in your longing, has it almost exactly backwards. The work is not subtraction. It is slowly and with enormous patience the work of revision, of updating the prediction, of allowing new evidence to accumulate in a nervous system that was taught to discount it. Every time you stay present through a partner's silence without reaching for the phone, and the silence turns out to be just silence, that is a data point. Every time the discomfort of receiving consistent warmth is tolerated long enough for the warmth to actually land, that is a data point. Every time the alarm fires and you choose to observe it rather than obey it, that is a revision, filed into the prediction system, one quiet evening at a time. If this is work you are moving toward, and you are here, which suggests something, the research on long-term therapy for anxious attachment has specific things to say about what actually shifts. Across attachment-based approaches, emotionally focused therapy, EMDR, and somatic work, a consistent finding appears. Clients describe their therapist as functioning, in some felt sense, like a surrogate attachment figure. Studies examining therapeutic attachment found that the quality of the relational bond itself, calibrated to the client's specific attachment needs, was associated with meaningful reductions in interpersonal difficulty. Not the technique primarily, the relationship. Because the relationship is the mechanism. Because what was damaged in relationship can only, ultimately, be repaired in one. What those who arrive at earned security share is not a history without difficulty. It is the integration of one. And that integration was not found. It was built, one corrective experience at a time. It is not the absence of fear that constitutes healing. It is learning to act in the presence of fear until the fear learns something new. The phone is on the table in front of you. The anxiety is still there. Of course it is. It has been there a long time, and it does not simply end because you have named it. The alarm is still technically running. You are not, in this moment, a calm and unbothered version of yourself who has left all of this behind. But you know something now. You know what the alarm is. It is not telling you the truth about right now. It is telling you the truth about a different moment. A much older one, a much smaller body. A room where the stakes really were high, and the top sounds. Silence really did mean something. It is not a character flaw. It is not a measure of how worthy you are of love. The part of you that has always needed to know, that has needed the small thread of another person's attention to feel like the ground is solid, was not born needy. It was made careful. And careful, when there was something to be careful of, was exactly right. The work now is not to silence it. It is to stay present long enough, in safe enough moments, for the alarm to file a different kind of report. Silence that turns out to be just silence, gathered one quiet evening at a time. If tonight reached you somewhere, a like or subscribe keeps this channel going. It means more people find their way here, to this kind of slow and careful company. Let your breathing slow. The room is quiet, and the night is long, and you do not have to hold any of this tightly. Whatever you are reaching for, you can set it down now. Your nervous system is still learning. So is everyone else's.